This series has explained how senseless NATO expansion caused a war in Ukraine. Ever since American President George W. Bush announced plans to add Ukraine and Georgia to NATO in 2008, Russian leaders said this third expansion of NATO would not be allowed. Since most people of Ukraine and its president didn't support joining NATO, the United States organized a coup in 2014 and replaced its democratic government with one supportive of becoming an American vassal state. This never occurred as several NATO members stalled efforts to add Ukraine. So the United States began making Ukraine a de facto member by providing billions of dollars to greatly expand, train, and equip its army. Russian objections to this provocation were ignored for years, so in late 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin sent NATO a draft treaty, really an ultimatum, as NATO head Jens Stoltenberg admitted in 2023.
The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that.
His comments shocked the international community because Western leaders, to include Stoltenberg, had promoted a lie that the Ukraine war was not caused by the expansion of NATO, but by Putin's plan to conquer Eastern Europe to expand Russian influence. Matt Orfala created a brilliant and funny video that consists of a series of short clips of politicians and media pundits denying the war was caused by NATO expansion. See his short video linked in the description to understand this massive American propaganda effort. Famous American professor John Mearsheimer had debunked that lie in several public appearances that can only be seen on YouTube since he's not invited on corporate television. Here is one from June 2022.
Conference on February 22nd, 2022. This is 2 days before they invade. Putin said, quote, "We are categorically opposed to Ukraine joining NATO because this poses a threat to us, and we have arguments to support this. I have repeatedly spoken about it in this hall." He then made it clear that he recognized that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. The United States and its allies, he said, quote, "continue to pump the current Kiev authorities full of modern types of weapons," end of quote. He went on to say that if this was not stopped, Moscow, quote, "would be left with an anti-Russia armed to the teeth. This is totally unacceptable." Putin's logic should be manifestly clear to Americans in the audience who have long understood, I'm sure, that we have a Monroe Doctrine which stipulates that no great power is allowed to place any of its military forces in the Western Hemisphere. I might note that in all of Putin's public statements during the months leading up to the war, there is not a scintilla of evidence that he was contemplating conquering Ukraine and making it part of Russia, much less attacking other countries in Eastern Europe. Other Russian leaders, including the defense minister, the foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador to Washington, also emphasized the centrality of NATO expansion for causing the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly at a press conference on January 14th, 2022, when he said, "The key to everything," I'm quoting Lavrov now, "the key to everything is the guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward." Nevertheless, the efforts of Lavrov and Putin to get the United States and its allies to abandon their efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border failed completely. Secretary of State Tony Blinken responded to Russia's mid-December demands by simply saying, quote, "There is no change, there will be no change." Putin then launched an invasion of Ukraine to eliminate the threat he saw from NATO.
Russia had demobilized its army after the Cold War ended, and it was much smaller in 2021. President Putin ordered available units to Ukraine's border to show he was serious about military action unless NATO agreed to abide by previous peace agreements and stay out of Ukraine. This graphic shows the buildup of soldiers by both sides prior to Russia's military intervention. This was detected by Western intelligence because the Russians announced they would soon intervene, so there was no element of surprise. After NATO refused to discuss peace, Putin ordered Russian troops to cross the border to protect ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. 14,000 had been killed by the Ukrainian army since 2015 after they arrived to crush a rebellion by Russian militias who refused to accept the new puppet government installed by the Americans after their coup in 2014. The two Donbas provinces had declared independence and asked to join Russia. President Putin had just accepted a similar request from the province of Crimea that hosted key Russian military bases. He did not accept this plea from the two in the Donbas, thinking the problem could be settled peacefully. This was resolved with the 2014 Minsk Agreement and another in 2015. These were ignored by Ukraine, whose soldiers kept randomly firing into Donbas cities. There was yet another agreement, called the Steinmeier Formula, signed by Ukraine's new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, in Paris in 2019, that was never implemented by Ukraine. Despite its small army, everyone knew that Russia could expand it if necessary. It has 4 times the population of Ukraine, 10 times its economic power, and more advanced military equipment. Yet even the ominous presence of Russia's forces on Ukraine's border failed to encourage implementation of signed peace agreements, so Putin reluctantly ordered Russian troops into the Donbas to help local militias expel Ukrainian troops in what he called a special military operation. This led to difficult fighting, as Ukraine's army had years to prepare for this possibility, and twice as many soldiers in eastern Ukraine, although the Russians had twice as many armored vehicles and aircraft. Ukrainian defensive fortifications had been built in the Donbas and stocked with lots of ammunition. However, the Russians surprised the Ukrainians by sending forces from the north toward Kyiv and by quickly crossing a bridge from Crimea in the south. Perhaps the Russians hoped the Ukrainian army would refuse to fight and they could march into Kyiv because the Russian force was far too small to capture that large city. They made good progress, but the Ukrainians fought back while the Russians learned that advances in anti-tank weaponry had made tank-led assaults foolish. The Russians easily captured a nuclear power plant at Kherson in the south, where Ukrainian forces withdrew without a fight for unknown reasons. Putin's special military operation was a success, as Ukraine quickly agreed to a peace agreement to end the fighting. However, the Anglo-American Empire wanted the war to continue, even though Ukraine was sure to lose in the long run. It directed Ukrainian leaders to fight on by promising massive NATO aid would soon arrive to turn back the Russians. After more Ukrainian units and CIA-paid mercenary forces arrived in eastern Ukraine, the Russians were outnumbered 3-1. The Russian army was bogged down in bloody urban battles and too small to defend the long front line. The Russians wisely withdrew to shorten its defense line in some areas, which Western propagandists heralded as Ukrainian victories. Russian President Putin realized he needed a much larger army to win, so began a major mobilization effort that would take a year to accomplish. A massive Western propaganda campaign was launched to demonize Putin to justify billions of dollars in aid for Ukraine. The lies promoted in Western corporate media was that Russia's attack was unprovoked and was part of an effort by Putin to conquer all of Europe. This series has explained NATO's numerous provocations. Professor Mearsheimer did a great job destroying the myth that Putin wanted to conquer Europe.
Now, the conventional wisdom in the West is that what is happening here is that Putin is an imperialist and he is bent on creating a greater Russia or recreating the Soviet Union. And what he is intent on doing in Ukraine is conquering that country, occupying that country, and integrating it into a greater Russia. And in fact, Ukraine is the first stop on the train line. When he's done with Ukraine, he's going to move on to other states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Poland, who knows. But he is an imperialist at heart. He's an aggressor who's interested in building an empire. This is the conventional wisdom that you all know well. I would imagine that most of you believe this. My view is this is simply wrong. There's no evidence to support it. I believe that if you're going to make that argument, you have to show evidence that Putin said it was desirable to conquer Ukraine and create a greater Russia. You have to show evidence that he thought it was feasible to do that. And you have to show evidence that he said that that's what he was doing. There is no evidence, and I want to underline that word, no. There is no evidence that he thought it was desirable to conquer Ukraine or to create a greater Russia or to conquer any other country. There's no evidence that he thought it was feasible. And there's no evidence that he said that's what he was doing. Furthermore, he does not have the capability to do it. The Russians invaded Ukraine with 190,000 men. There's no way 190,000 men could conquer a piece of real estate with 40 plus million people in it with 190,000 men. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, they went in with 1.5 million men. You need a huge army to conquer a country like Ukraine, occupy it, and incorporate it into your country. And you're not going to do that with 190,000 men.
Poland went to war in 1939 expecting promised support from its new French and British allies. German generals later admitted their western border had few troops and a major French offensive couldn't be stopped. But the French army only made a small incursion and then withdrew, while the British never landed forces on Poland's northern coast. See the short tale linked in the description. Poland lost World War II. This conflict is very similar to the one in 2022 Ukraine. The Germans had demanded that Poland return small areas that it was forced to cede in 1919, even though Germans were the majority population, shown in brown on this map. Poland would have relented if not for false promises of military help from new allies in the West. Once the Russians outnumbered the Ukrainian army in the Donbass region in the autumn of 2023 and had 4 times more armored vehicles and 10 times more aircraft and artillery systems, Russian armies began to attack, and the result was certain. If Ukraine had resisted NATO overtures, it would not have lost any territory nor suffered from a disastrous war. It is now obvious that American leaders saw the people of Ukraine as cannon fodder to blast and weaken Russia, as heartless neocon Senator Lindsey Graham stated in 2023.
Ask me, is it worth it? Here's what we've gotten for our investment. We haven't lost one soldier. We've reduced the combat power of the Russian army by 50%, Not one of us has died in that endeavor. This is a great deal for America.
You've